The shells were walking closer, and the hospital behind me had already begun to break apart. I carried another man through the smoke, knowing the system that was meant to receive him was failing. The orders said return to the line and leave the rest to procedure. But there was no procedure left, only distance and falling stone. In November 1943, near the town of Ortona, on the Adriatic coast of Italy, Allied infantry units advanced slowly through shattered farmland and narrow streets. The campaign had already stretched supply lines and exhausted medical services. Rain turned fields into mud. Artillery exchanges were frequent and imprecise. The operational situation required small units to move forward under constant shell fire while casualty stations struggled to keep pace. Within one of these units served a frontline medic assigned to an infantry company. His work followed established procedure. He moved with the riflemen, carried bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, and field dressings. He wore a helmet marked with a red cross, though experience had taught him that markings did not guarantee safety. His duty was to reach the wounded, stop bleeding, stabilize fractures, and arrange evacuation to a regimental aid post set up behind the line. The field hospital supporting the sector operated from a requisitioned farmhouse several kilometers to the rear. It was intended as a temporary station. Canvas cots filled the ground floor. Surgeons worked in a cleared dining room under hanging lamps powered by a portable generator. Ambulances moved along cratered roads when fuel and drivers were available, but the system relied on steady movement. Casualties were not meant to accumulate. By mid-November, that movement had begun to fail. German artillery targeted crossroads and bridges. Stretcher teams found routes cut by collapsed walls and fallen masonry. Rainwater flooded shell holes, forcing men to detour through exposed streets. The medic noticed delays increasing. Wounded men lay longer before reaching the aid post. Some bled through field dressings that would have held if transport had been faster. His routine remained methodical. He checked pulses. He tied tourniquets when necessary. He applied sulfa to open wounds. He recorded names and injuries on tags pinned to uniforms. When possible, he reassured men without promising outcomes. He signaled stretcher bearers by whistle or hand gesture. When none were available, he lifted casualties himself or enlisted uninjured riflemen to help. The operational problem developed gradually. Artillery density increased as Allied units approached the town center. Barrages lasted hours. The farmhouse hospital, though set back from the front, lay within range of heavier guns positioned inland. On several occasions, shells landed in surrounding fields. Windows shattered, dust filtered down from rafters. Staff continued to operate, but tension rose. The medic first saw signs of systemic strain when he returned from the front with 2 wounded soldiers and found the ground floor crowded beyond capacity. Cots stood so close that orderlies could barely pass between them. A surgeon worked without pause. The generator failed intermittently. Kerosene lamps supplemented light. Blood soaked into wooden floorboards. By the smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke drifting from distant fires. He was instructed to leave the wounded and return immediately to the line. There was no time for rest. The infantry company had taken additional losses in a failed push toward a crossroads. Reports indicated enemy machine gun nests remained active. The medic moved back through mud and debris, aware that evacuation intervals were lengthening. In the following days, the rhythm of his work shifted. Instead of short dashes under sporadic fire, he began to move through sustained bombardment. Shells fell without warning. Shrapnel struck walls and pavement. He learned to judge pauses in fire by sound alone. During lulls, he sprinted. During active bursts, he lay flat beside the wounded, shielding them as best he could. Evacuation routes narrowed. One bridge collapsed under shelling, forcing ambulances to reroute along a single road that had already been cratered. Fuel shortages reduced the number of vehicles. At times, stretcher bearers carried casualties for hours before reaching the hospital. The medic adjusted by performing more extensive stabilization at the point of injury. He splinted fractures more carefully. He administered plasma when available. Supplies dwindled quickly. Official doctrine emphasized rapid evacuation to surgical facilities. In practice, the medic found himself extending the window of frontline care. He remained longer beside severely wounded men, aware that transport might not arrive soon. The weight of that knowledge altered his calculations. Morphine doses were measured carefully. He could not assume immediate surgery. But the farmhouse hospital absorbed a steady stream of casualties from multiple companies. Surgeons operated continuously. Instruments were sterilized in makeshift boilers. The generator's failures grew more frequent. On one evening in late November, a direct artillery hit struck an outbuilding used for storage. Supplies were destroyed. No staff were killed, but the shock was visible. Staff members spoke less. The medic observed early signs of institutional limitation. Requests for additional ambulances went unanswered. Communications lines were cut repeatedly. Messages were sent by runner. Weather reports predicted further rain. Infantry officers pressed for renewed assaults despite mounting losses. Medical staff worked within constraints they did not control. Escalation followed as fighting entered Ortona's narrow streets. Close quarters combat increased casualties. Rubble complicated movement. Buildings collapsed unpredictably. The medic moved room to room behind advancing riflemen. He dragged wounded men down stairwells. He carried others across open courtyards swept by sniper fire. His uniform became stiff with dried mud and blood. Repeated strain showed in small details. His hands shook when reloading morphine syrettes. He began marking casualty tags more quickly, handwriting compressed to save time. He no longer waited for stretcher teams before seeking the next wounded man. When none were available, he improvised stretchers from doors torn off hinges. The farmhouse hospital reached a breaking point during a week of concentrated shelling. Artillery observers had identified the area as a logistical node. Several shells landed within meters of the main building. One penetrated the roof but failed to detonate. Another struck the courtyard, wounding an orderly. The medical staff continued to function, yet the risk was no longer theoretical. The medic arrived one afternoon with 3 wounded men and found the courtyard partially collapsed. Cots had been moved into a cellar. Surgeons operated in reduced light. Water seeped through cracked walls. An administrator informed him that evacuation to a larger hospital farther south had been delayed due to road closures. Casualties would remain overnight. He returned to the line, aware that the safety margin had narrowed. That night, shelling intensified. Infantry positions shifted only meters at a time. Casualties accumulated in basements and alleyways. The medic moved continuously, sometimes crawling to reach a wounded soldier pinned by debris. He relied on muscle memory to apply bandages in darkness. The turning point came when a sustained artillery barrage targeted the area behind the front with unusual precision. Reports later suggested aerial observation had corrected enemy fire. Shells struck in sequence along the road leading to the farmhouse hospital. Ambulances attempting to approach were forced to retreat. The medic, carrying a wounded infantryman on his shoulders, heard the pattern of impacts and recognized the direction. Upon reaching the outskirts of the hospital grounds, he saw smoke rising from the main building. Part of the roof had collapsed. Orderlies carried stretchers away from falling debris. A surgeon stood in the courtyard directing movement toward a nearby barn that offered partial shelter. The generator had failed completely. Only lanterns provided light. The medic did not remain long. He deposited the wounded man in the barn and returned toward the front, as instructed. Official guidance required him to prioritize new casualties. Yet he was aware that the hospital itself was now under direct threat. The line between front and rear had dissolved. Throughout the night, he carried wounded men through intermittent shellfire toward a facility that was steadily losing capacity. At times, he encountered stretcher teams moving in the opposite direction, seeking safer ground. The sense of forward evacuation was replaced by lateral displacement. Casualties were relocated from one compromised structure to another. But risk became personal when a shell landed within meters as he crossed an open stretch of road with a wounded soldier secured in a fireman's carry. The blast knocked both men to the ground. The medic regained footing, checked the soldier's airway, and continued. His helmet bore a dent from shrapnel. He did not pause to examine it. By morning, the farmhouse hospital was largely unusable. Walls were fractured. Equipment lay buried under rubble. Several staff members had been injured. Remaining patients were dispersed among smaller aid stations. Official communication described the situation as a temporary relocation. In practice, the centralized field hospital for that sector had fallen silent. The medic adjusted without ceremony. Instead of directing casualties toward a single known point, he began triaging them according to proximity of the nearest intact structure. A church basement served briefly as a surgical site. A warehouse was converted into a dressing station. Each location lacked full equipment. Procedures were abbreviated. Some wounded men waited longer than Doctrine allowed. Institutional pushback appeared in subtle forms. A medical officer cautioned against exceeding authorized morphine doses despite the absence of surgical capacity. An infantry officer urged the medic to remain closer to the advancing platoon rather than escorting wounded men rearward. The medic navigated these pressures without confrontation. He complied outwardly while continuing to carry men to whatever shelter remained. Stakes peaked quietly during a period when no functioning surgical site operated within immediate reach. Severely wounded men lay in makeshift stations awaiting transport that might not arrive before nightfall. The medic faced decisions that Doctrine did not fully address. He prioritized those with survivable injuries and stabilized others as long as supplies permitted. He did not announce these choices. They were understood through action. Consequences unfolded over the following days. Casualty rates declined slightly as the infantry secured more defensible positions within the town. Engineers cleared debris from key roads, allowing limited ambulance movement to resume. A new field hospital was established farther south, beyond effective artillery range. The system reassembled in altered form. Records from the period noted the destruction of a medical facility due to enemy fire, but reports commended staff for maintaining operations under difficult conditions. Individual actions at the level of the frontline medic were summarized in brief phrases. There was no extended citation for carrying wounded men through artillery fire. His work was recorded as continuous duty. In the weeks after Ortona, he remained with his unit. The dented helmet was replaced. Supplies were replenished. Procedures returned to a more predictable rhythm. Yet the memory of a hospital silenced by shelling lingered within the medical staff. They understood that markings and distance offered limited protection in modern warfare. The medic did not speak publicly about those nights. He resumed routine tasks. He cleaned instruments. He restocked bandages. He trained replacements in basic first aid. The institutional response to the hospital's destruction was procedural. A new site was mapped. Defensive camouflage was improved. Contingency plans were revised. His legacy remained tied to the role itself. Frontline medics operated between doctrine and reality, adapting under fire while preserving as much of the evacuation chain as conditions allowed. Their work rarely altered strategic outcomes. It sustained individual lives within a system under strain. By the end of the Italian campaign, medical services had adjusted to lessons learned from repeated exposure to artillery targeting. Field hospitals were dispersed more widely. Evacuation routes were diversified. Yet the vulnerability of medical facilities near active fronts persisted. The medic continued to serve until the war's conclusion in Europe. Official documents listed his assignments and noted standard commendations for service. They did not detail each journey across open ground under shellfire. Such actions were considered part of expected duty. In post-war years, discussions of the campaign often centered on territorial gains and command decisions. Less attention was given to the quiet labor of those who carried the wounded when infrastructure collapsed. The fallen farmhouse hospital was not preserved as a monument. It returned to civilian use, rebuilt without markers. Within archival records, one can trace the sequence of shelling reports and relocation orders that correspond to those nights in November 1943. They form a pattern of institutional resilience and limitation. At the center of that pattern stood individuals who acted without public recognition. But the frontline medic's work illustrated the fragile link between battlefield injury and survival. When the field hospital fell silent, he continued to move through artillery fire, extending that link by physical effort alone. His actions did not appear in strategic communiques. They were measured in the number of wounded men who reached shelter despite disruption. The campaign in Italy advanced slowly thereafter. Town by town, positions changed hands. Medical units followed, setting up and dismantling facilities as conditions required. The memory of Ortona remained part of professional knowledge passed quietly among medical personnel. Today, the story of such a medic offers insight into the functioning of wartime medical systems under stress. It reveals how doctrine meets circumstance and how individuals adapt when structures fail. While the record is restrained, but the implications are clear. For those who study the Italian campaign, the destruction of a field hospital is a logistical event within a larger operation. For the medic who carried the wounded through artillery fire until the hospital fell silent, it was a moment when responsibility narrowed to immediate action. If you value careful, historically grounded accounts of overlooked roles in World War II, consider supporting this channel so these stories remain part of the record.